From Lebanon to Hong Kong, Haiti to the UK, people are out on the streets demanding change. The issues are many, from corruption to climate change. So as global protests appear to be on the rise, we ask, what's driving these demonstrations? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Rochelle Carey. People in different parts of the world are increasingly expressing their discontent with our government's policies. It's impossible these days for us to report the news without mentioning a protest somewhere in the world. Many of the specific issues may be different, but there are common themes at their core: corruption, injustice, climate change, human rights. Protesters are challenging authorities, even in places where it was once considered unthinkable to do so. But just as the demands are varied, so are the outcomes. Some have found success through their campaigns, others have not. And governments are divided on how to address what appears to be a global phenomenon of protest movements. Let's take a closer look at some of the protests that are happening right now. In Lebanon, crowds are calling for a complete overhaul of their government, angry over a crumbling economy. Hong Kong has experienced months of protests against what's seen as a growing influence from Beijing. In Catalonia, days of marches have consumed the region's streets as the pro and anti-secession movements make their voices heard. In Chile, Sudan, Haiti, and around the world, people are angry and they're out on the streets.
I am for the reforms. I am against the destruction of Lebanon. Lebanon has been badly damaged by the politicians for 30 years. Today their thrones are shaking. I am with the reforms and early parliamentarian elections.
If you have a little bit of morality, a little bit of nationalism, if you have a little bit of love for the country, then please hand over the keys, because the people can't stand it any longer. We're asking you to step down. Step down. Let the people go. We can't take it any longer.
Social injustice is everywhere. The minority concentrates all the wealth. This is about how they rob us in supermarkets, in healthcare, how they profit with our pensions.
And there have been some historic protests over the past 10 years. The Arab Spring, of course, took place in 2011. It shook the foundations of countries across North Africa and the Middle East. In the U.S., the killing of an unarmed black man triggered nationwide marches that gave rise to the Black Lives Matter movement. In 2014, an uprising in Ukraine altered the course of that country. The recent Yellow Vest movement in France and Brexit protests in the UK seek to do the same. In Latin America, corruption and struggling economies have triggered mass protests in Brazil and Venezuela. And earlier this year, a global climate strike rallied support from millions around the world. Let's bring in our panel now. Joining us in Winchester, the UK, Matt Clement, a senior lecturer in the Department of Applied Social Sciences at the University of Winchester. In Berlin, Jean-Baptiste Galopin, a sociologist who received a doctorate from Yale University earlier this year. And in Lancaster, also in the UK, Melindo Misra, a senior lecturer in the Department of Politics, Philosophy, and Religion. Welcome to all of you. Matt, I'll start with you. Is it just us, or does it seem like that there has been a decade of protests and that the numbers really seem to be increasing, at least over the past year or two?
I think it has been a decade of protest. As you said, really, the 2011 was when it kicked off in quite a big scale, not just in the Arab world, but also with anti-austerity protests in Greece, in Britain over pensions, in France, etc., and the Occupy movement in Spain. So that was quite a big, and in America, of course. So that was quite a big start to it. But really, it's only continued since then.
Jean-Baptiste, what have your observations been, as it seems that every month, every week, there is a new protest, and it seems to be varied in its locations. There's not a continent, it seems, that hasn't been touched by this.
Yeah, I think it's typical of protest movements to come in waves. I mean, in Europe, experienced this in 1848, and there is an emulation aspect to these movements. People see other countries going through these movements, and they start, following the examples. But I think if you look at how events unfold at a national level, it's a lot of the time has to do with informal movements, and the traditional, conventional wisdom in social science studies is that the social movement organizations proceed first by accumulating resources, or they see a political opportunity and then they jump in. But what you see actually is, and in a lot of these cases, people react to an event that really causes indignation and anger. And this first kind of explosion of unrest then encourages people to take further action. So this is what you see right now in Lebanon with this decision by the government to tax WhatsApp calls, which really symbolized, I think, the iniquity of the Lebanese government and prompted a number of people to go on the streets. And very quickly, the dynamics change and the protest movement takes life on its own.
I think that's a great point. Melinda, I'd like your thoughts on that, too. Is there some sort of commonality when it comes to a tipping point that really pushes people out in the streets? Obviously, for varying countries, there's always different underlying issues that have perhaps been bubbling up. But is there a common thread when it comes to a tipping point where people just say, I'm not taking this anymore?
Well, at the heart of this debate, at the heart of this undertaking, what we have is something called deficit of trust. People are no longer trusting their governments. People are no longer certain that whatever the government is doing on their behalf is for their good. And that is one of the reasons why people are coming out into the street. So the tipping point that you're talking about is when people realize that they have to take things onto their own hands to make that change, to bring about that transformation. And that is exactly what we're witnessing from Hong Kong to Ecuador, from Arab Spring to what is happening now in Chile. So there is not only that deficit of trust, but people also feel that they can bring about that transformation. They do not need that government. They do not need the official apparatus to bring about that transformation. So that belief in their power, their own self-belief, the community spirit has propelled these movements to the forefront that we have been witnessing in the last 1 decade or so.
Matt, I saw you nodding to that when he said a deficit of trust, and that being the tipping point. But when you talk about a deficit of trust, what are the types of things that contribute to that? That's got to be a really extreme thing for people to feel like they're almost in it alone and their government's not in it with them.
Absolutely. But I think that's the point, that extremism or radicalism is becoming more mainstreamed. It becomes a more normal option for many people to take who perhaps in the past would not have considered it. And this is because the existing arrangements, what Tariq Ali called the extreme centre, talking about the market-based politics of neoliberalism, which kind of govern economic regimes in all parts of the world, are seen as failing the majority of the population in whichever country you talk about. So that's what's led to the loss of faith. And then, as the last speaker was saying, as the momentum of getting involved in street protest and masses of people getting together, I believe that getting organised as a crowd starts to change the consciousness of those people involved. You only have to look at somewhere like Hong Kong. What began as a protest simply about a threatened, dangerous extradition law, but now many of the young people are talking about a revolution needed in Hong Kong. They've really expanded their demands, and that's come out of the experience of kind of fighting together on the streets and organising together on the streets. So that process itself has changed the people themselves.
I realize that you're not necessarily an expert on Hong Kong specifically, but you know these issues, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that one thing that has been really striking about Hong Kong is the length of these protests, and the intensity really seems to be there. They seem to be extremely organized. What are some of your observations about the protests in Hong Kong in particular?
Yes, I think it's been a remarkable level of coordination. You can see the imagination that people show when you look at the ways in which people disguise themselves and mask up in different ways so that they don't get recognized by the omnipresent security cameras. The way that they adjust their tactics to try and make sure that the forces of repression cannot kind of beat them off the streets is very, very notable in the Hong Kong case. And I think it is a sign of a growing level of radicalization. And then some of the arguments about, are the Hong Kong protesters, for example, pro-Western, is simply not true. A lot of their complaints have been about the policing of them. Many of the senior police officers are actually from the ex-colonial regime or ex-British police officers, in fact. So I think that, they're just talking about organising for their rights and organising on a massive scale.
Jean-Baptiste, let's go back to 2011 to Tunisia that can kind of be seen as something that kind of set all of this off. What worked in Tunisia?
Well, we can talk about the political transition, but first I'd like to go back to the question of what really explains these demonstrations. And I'd like to really offer a counterpoint to this idea that it really all has to do with a lack of trust. I think there are many countries where people lack trust in their government, but it doesn't mean they actually go on into the street to demonstrate, because most of the time, most people anticipate that other people are not going to go and protest. So there is a really important dynamic in protest movements, which is when people readjust their expectations, when they start to believe that other people are going to go into the streets. And in an authoritarian regime, as we saw in Tunisia and throughout the Arab Spring, it's very difficult because people are afraid of being killed or ending up in jail. So in these settings where protests are often very unusual, the mere fact of having a demonstration in itself can contribute to shattering this idea that people have that other people are going to acquiesce to power. And which is why the dynamics of protest growth are really crucial. And in the case of Tunisia, because this protest was unprecedented, and it also happened to come at a time where social media, the influence of social media was really starting to be felt, they escalated extremely quickly and they caused panic in the government. And ultimately, the success, we can talk about the organizers' tactics, but ultimately the success of a protest movement always has to do with the dynamics of who the target group. In the case of the Arab Spring, it was authoritarian regimes. And ultimately, it has to do with it's a strategic game with psychological and social aspect. But basically, the goal is to convince the target that they have nothing else, they can do nothing else but comply. And for this, once you see things this way, you can understand why issues such as the internal solidarity of the target group is crucial. So in Syria, because the military and security apparatus was united by sectarian ties, since they were dominated by Alawites, they could not envision a situation in which conceding would actually yield anything good for them. In Tunisia, it was very different because the military and security apparatus was professional, and once the protest reached a certain size, they understood that their only option was either to kill a large number of civilians or to turn their weapons against Ben Ali, which is eventually what happened, much like it happened in Egypt. So I think the dynamics we often focus on the actual protest movement themselves, but it's very important to take into account the dynamics of the target groups, in most cases, the state and its elite.
So, Linda, what about that? About what does it take for there to be cracks in the groups that are targeted? Say the military, turning on a leader or something like that. What causes those types of cracks?
Well, what we are witnessing at the moment is that now, for the first time in human history, perhaps in the 21st century, masses feel that they can talk to the power without any fear, that they can march and the whole world will be watching and they will be taken care of. That is exactly what is happening if we talk about the nonviolent protests from Arab Spring to Hong Kong. So that is a big thing, because in the past, the governments could imagine what was happening in 1990, Tiananmen Square, when you had that lone individual who was standing in front of a marching tank and he was mowed down. So if you look at 1990 and 2019, almost 30 years, 3 decades, we see a sea change happening here. So governments are much more cautious as to how they should behave, even if they are military juntas.
Let me ask you something about that, though. And I see what you're saying, that the protesters feel like, if we can get the eyes of the world on us, maybe that will give us some level of safety. But does that actually, in some cases, just force the government to use different tactics? I mean, people get disappeared all the time in jails.
Well, I can give you a very recent example which took place 2 weeks back. That was Ecuador. And the government of Lenin Moreno undertook some austerity measures, which was a part of the new liberal program, of course, and people went out into the street. The government had to change the capital from Quito to Guayaquil, and the whole thing went on for 2 weeks. Finally, the international community, that is United Nations, and the Roman Catholic Church had to intervene on behalf of the masses, the indigenous people, and the government finally had to give in terms of sort of pulling back all the austerity measures that it had introduced. So I would say that yes, people are taking this cosmopolitan responsibility seriously. So if Hong Kong protest has been a success so far, it is because that cosmopolitan responsibility that has come in way of support from other powers, other masses all over the world. So that is something that we haven't had in the past. And fortunately, that has given the ammunition, peaceful protest movement has succeeded because of that.
Matt, let me ask you, we were talking a lot about Hong Kong because it's been such a sustained movement. But part of the Hong Kong tactics has been, I guess you could say, extreme civil disobedience. I mean, at one point, the airport was partially shut down. It's disrupted trains. When movements take life, when they take hold, do they have to plan for not, for lack of a better word, ticking the public off at some point?
Well, I think initially speaking, there's often a tendency to think, can we find a middle path that allows some degree of compromise that doesn't push things right to the edge? Because initially, protesters are often worried about alienating a passive majority that haven't yet joined them on the streets, who they want at least supporting them, if not actively at least passively, maybe actively supporting them. So initially, maybe there's some pressure towards moderation. But as protests become sustained, then they grow in momentum. Potentially more people join, and also, like I said, people can see that. But possibly those moderate options don't really work for them. You know, if you think about the Extinction Rebellion movement that's been popping up all over the globe at the moment against climate change, you know, that is a recognition that there's very, very little faith in any institutional capacity to deliver reform, or even if they're capable, no willingness to deliver reform. And therefore, it's only by the people acting and demonstrating in powerful ways that pressure can be brought to bear, they believe.
Jean-Baptiste, the protests that we've been seeing over the past decade, they have been in dictatorships and authoritative regimes and democracies as well. What does it take more for people in a democracy to actually go out and protest because maybe they have in a functioning democracy, that is, because they have a sense of comfort? I mean, what's the difference that motivates people in those different types of situations?
Well, I think the barrier for, the threshold for activism is much higher in an authoritarian setting because the risks of being killed or being thrown in jail are much more important, obviously. I think the biggest challenge that demonstrators have to face in democracies is that the protests are routinized. We have a series of laws that allow protests under certain conditions, and as a result, they do not represent a political crisis. Most of the time, they are just part of the normal life of a democracy. And as a result, they really fail to create among the target group, the government, most of the time, the feeling that there is an extraordinary set of events that they need to react to, which is why the strategy of occupying spaces, which is illegal in most democracy, which started with Occupy Wall Street and we see now with Extinction Rebellion, is actually very efficient because it breaks this understanding that the protest movement is just like another protest movement. And that's crucial, I think, to forcing government elites to consider the possibility that they will have to compromise. Now, I'd like to go back to the point that you broached with the other guests regarding what prompts cracks in an authoritarian setting. I think leaving the case of Hong Kong aside, because it's a kind of foreign occupying power, in most authoritarian settings, what prompts cracks within the military and security apparatus is really a critical mass of demonstrators in a capital city. If it happens in a provincial town, it's a regional rebellion. If it's a small protest in a capital city, it doesn't really threaten the regime. Once you have a critical mass of people in the capital city, it creates the possibility. It sows doubt among members of the military and security apparatus that the regime is going to survive. And once they start doubting that the regime is going to survive, then they start to consider the possibility that they will not obey orders. And once officers of the military and security apparatus start to doubt that they will obey orders, they make themselves open to the possibility of a rebellion. And when a rebellion starts, ultimately, the worst outcome is a civil war between loyalists and rebels, which encourages, under some conditions, officers to actually tag along with the rebellion, even if they don't particularly dislike the regime. So there you have a kind of complex game of anticipation within the government, which I think makes this moment extremely sensitive to small incidents and small events that can tilt the direction of the country as a whole.
Okay, let me bring in Amalindo to this. In democracies, can a vote be considered a protest? I mean, for example, voting, for Brexit, could that be classified as a protest vote?
Yes, you can. When you are talking about bringing about a change, a transformation, a regime change, if we talk about, then we can say that it is a form of protest. But it is a protest that is guaranteed to every citizen to bring about a new government every 4 years or 5 years or whatever may be the term. But here protest implies that you are so dissatisfied that you are unhappy with the current regime. So it is happening within that specific time span, let's say 5 years. So that is the reason why you want either to change the government so that a new government can come in and pick up from where you had started, or you want to get rid of every uncertain things that you are facing at the moment. So yes, it can take place in a democracy through a voting system, but what we are witnessing is that that ability or that space or that process is not enough to plenty of people in different places. And if there is a reckoning that things are not going to change, if we are going to have more of the same in the next 4 years, next 5 years, or what have you, that leads to a certain sense of exasperation, a certain degree of disillusionment, and that forces individuals to go to the streets. And it could also become a part in a democratic process where they realize that the government is not going to do anything because its hands are tied, or the international system is such that it is going to undermine the masses. Now let's talk about what is happening in Chile as we speak. There has been a protest movement, and it is because the government has taken certain austerity measures, and people are out in the street. People have been killed, there have been lynching, there have been firebomb attacks, factories have been set on fire. Why is that happening? It is happening because the government is forced to take a certain stand, which the masses find unpalatable. So, to cut a long story short, it can take place within a democracy by changing voting behavior. But at the same time, when people feel that they don't have any other choice, they feel that they have to come out into the street.
Okay. We're just about out of time, but I'm going to try to get in one more quick question to you, Matthew. Is income inequality driving a lot of what's happening?
I believe it's having a very significant effect because it's unavoidable. It's not just that sense of injustice that comes from seeing the gap getting bigger and bigger between richer and poorer. But, so many public services that people rely upon are continually being privatized or plans to privatize them. So that, even ways that you want to carry on, ways that people think, well, I'd rather just continue with my life as it is and not protest, they find that avenue is constantly cut off up, for example, by degrading the quality of the hospitals. And I would argue, certainly in the British case, it's the degrading of so many aspects of our public services through austerity, which created the bitterness, which in the end led to it coming out in the vote to leave in the 2016 referendum, and then all the kind of political shockwaves that have continued in the country since then.
Matthew, that will be the last word. Gentlemen, thank you all for joining me for this discussion. I appreciate it very much. Matthew Clement, Jean-Baptiste Galopin, and Amalindo Misra. And thank you for watching. You can see the program again anytime. Visit our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For me, Rochelle Carey, and the entire team here in Doha, bye for now.